Hi, everybody. So as you can see, I'm sitting in front of a fireplace today, um, mostly because I just learned that you could do this and I thought it was really cool. Um, it's also wild because I can like make parts of myself disappear. And go, oh, where'd my shoulder go? Um, but the picture that I chose, the background that I chose is relevant to our discussion today, and you will see how in a little bit. I'm going to try to be a little bit more still so I don't keep disappearing. Or maybe I'll just be without a shoulder. I don't know. Um, anyway, so today's message um, is about a program called the New Deal, which was our progressive response to the Great Depression. So, in the last video, I explained how things kind of got worse and worse as we went into the 1930s. And the reaction from President Hoover wasn't really the one that people were looking for. And then I mentioned at the end of the video that times of great trouble usually call for great change, great progress. And that's what we're going to be looking at today in this video. So, we're going to see the election of a new president in 1932, and I'm going to show you his picture in just a moment. That president is going to be none other than Franklin Roosevelt. And here he is, that guy. Um, Franklin Roosevelt is a pretty interesting character. He was the cousin of Theodore Roosevelt, and his wife, Eleanor, was the niece of former President Theodore Roosevelt. So, if you do those calculations in your head, that means that yes, Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt were also cousins. It's like fifth cousins once removed or something like that. So not very closely related, but maybe a little bit strange for them to be married to one another. They actually got married on St. Patrick's Day in 1905. So as of 2 days ago, they would have been married for 115 years, which is insane. Um, so Franklin Roosevelt is elected in 1932, and he, of course, is going to serve longer than anyone else. This is still before we have those presidential term limits, so he's going to go beyond his 2 terms. He is or was a Democrat, and we're going to start to see kind of more of our like typical views of the Democratic Party or more modern day views of the Democratic Party um, coming in here as he's going to be looking to provide a lot more government influence into um, not only politics but also economics and just people's everyday lives. When he comes into office, his inaugural address is going to be remembered by the quotation that you see here. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself, which is something that you may have seen pop up a lot lately, as we are kind of in, uncharted waters as a nation right now. We're still trying to remind ourselves that, it's best to be calm and maintain kind of a steady, positive mindset about what's going on. Um, when Roosevelt comes into office, he has a lot that he's going to have to deal with. I mentioned yesterday that unemployment climbed to about 25%. So by the time he takes office, that number is going to be about 13 million people who were unemployed. And almost all of the banks had failed and closed or were on their way to that. So Franklin Roosevelt jumps into action in kind of this spur of, legislative writing and passage that he calls his first 100 days. And ever since his presidency, it's become kind of a trend to evaluate the first 100 days of a president to see how much they accomplished in that time, kind of like setting the stage for their presidency. Franklin Franklin Roosevelt's plan was called the New Deal, and these were his domestic policies that were designed to bring us out of the Great Depression. And as I mentioned a moment ago, that was going to mean that the government had a lot more control over everything, really. They were going to be much more hands on in managing the economy. So, a definite reversal from the laissez faire policies that we had seen during the Gilded Age and during our return to normalcy after World War One. The government was also going to play a bigger part in people's daily lives. I think I mentioned to you guys when we talked about the 1920s economy that at this point in time there were no safety nets. The government did not provide unemployment or Medicare or Medicaid or Social Security or food stamps or any of those services. So if you were struggling, there was really no one to help you unless, it was a church or a charity or your family members or whatever. So Franklin Roosevelt is going to be working to change that to create some of those, protectors that we have today. His New Deal was based around something that we call the 3 R's, and those 3 R's were relief, recovery, and reform. And I like to compare this to what might happen if you hurt yourself, like if you broke your arm or your leg or something like that. So the very first thing that you're going to seek is relief. You want to go to the doctor, go to the hospital, get it set, put in a cast, get some medication to help you feel better. And when you're hurt, that's the first thing you want, is to feel better. So the relief stage of the New Deal is designed to do that. We need to provide some support for Americans and help them to feel better and do better as they're struggling and suffering. So FDR is famous for his programs that were a part of the New Deal, and they all have these acronyms. So historians famously refer to his programs as alphabet soup because they're just filled with all of these programs that have these acronym names. So 2 examples under relief are the AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, and the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps. You might remember that one issue that we had was overproduction in agriculture. Farmers were overproducing to try to keep up with their costs, where, they had borrowed money and stuff like that during World War I to keep up with our agricultural needs then. That was weird. But then our needs changed, and we don't need that kind of production anymore, but they can't just quit because then they can't make a living. So the government is going to provide subsidies to farmers to help them pay their costs, but not produce. So this is basically the government saying, please, 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 farmers, stop producing so much. We will make sure that your cost of living is covered. We will provide funding to you, but we need you to stop producing. The Civilian Conservation Corps was created to put young men to work. So young single men who were not attached necessarily to a family and could just up and move and be sent around the country would go work on federally funded projects on government-owned land. So that might be working on things like dams and hydroelectricity, installing power lines, cutting trees to clear the way for future projects, et cetera, et cetera. And these were tasks that didn't necessarily need to be done right now, but it was a way to give people a paycheck, give people some relief. And I compare that to when you maybe have really, really wanted something in the past, especially when you were younger, before you had the option of going to work. Your parents might have you do chores to earn an allowance instead of just giving you money to get whatever you needed. And when they give you those chores, those aren't things that they necessarily have to have done. Cutting the grass, taking out the trash, whatever it might be, your parents are perfectly capable of doing those things for themselves. But they're trying to give you something to do to earn that money that they're giving to you. And this is kind of similar in that the government wanted to provide some relief to people, so they're kind of creating these projects to be done so that they can put money in people's pockets. Another way that Roosevelt provided relief was through his fireside chats, hence why I'm sitting in front of a fire today. These were radio addresses where FDR would sit beside his fire and people at home would sit beside their fires, and they would listen to these radio addresses. And in his addresses or his fireside chats, Roosevelt did a lot of just like reassurance of the people, saying, hey, this is what's going on. We have a plan. You're going to be okay. And the very first one that he did talked about the bank holiday, which we're going to mention again in a minute. But basically, the government was shutting down all the banks, and then they were going to work through a process of reopening them slowly. And that was a scary idea for people. So kind of like right now, we're experiencing some similarly scary things when school is closed, when, you know, the restaurants and the bars are limited on what they can do as far as servicing people, as other places of business are closing. People have a lot of concerns about their paychecks and how they'll make a living. And, you know, we're looking for that same kind of reassurance. And so that was what Franklin Roosevelt was doing, making sure that people knew that everything was going to be okay. It was tough, but there was a plan and it would work out. The second step of the 3 R's is recovery. And in our broken arm or leg scenario, this is when, you know, you might do some exercises or some stretches or some physical therapy or something like that to kind of recuperate and get yourself back to where you were before, building back your strength, you know, spending time in a cast or a boot or whatever you may have to keep yourself protected, just to bring you back to where you were before and help yourself to recover. So this is where we are. We have problems clearly that need to be addressed. But before we can do this, like, you know, broad sweeping change of things in the United States, we need to get back to where we were. So one example of this is not the National Rifle Association, but it is the National Recovery Act. And in that, the government set industry codes for prices and wages within business. So they're putting their hands more directly on business to establish some regulations that will make business stronger. So, you know, we start to make sure that our wealth that we have is real, and we you know, are working to avoid so much debt and so much loss through business. Another example was the bank holiday, which I had just mentioned. Basically, Roosevelt said all the banks, if they were still open, were going to close down, and then they would be slowly reopened based on their health, pretty much. So a lot of banks had been doing some pretty shady things with their books to make things seem right when they were doing things like loaning out money that was invested in the stock market. And that was part of the reason why we had this collapse of the banking system. So the books and the records would be evaluated, and the banks that were healthiest would be cleared to reopen. And then slowly all of the others would reopen as well. And in his fireside chat about the bank holiday, Roosevelt told people pretty much, like, you have to be smart. You can't go crazy. You have to have faith that this will work. And so when banks do start to reopen, you can't just rush out and go try to get your money, because that will put us back where we started. So again, similar to today, you know, we're being encouraged to be careful about what we're doing, trying to stay home, practice social distancing, and don't go to the store and hoard a bunch of stuff and panic buy a bunch of stuff that you don't need, because we have to be considerate of others. And this is the same kind of thing. Be calm, make smart decisions, because that's what's best for everyone in the whole country. Finally, we get to the last of the 3 R's, which is reform. Reform with your broken arm or broken leg or whatever scenario. This is when you've recovered, you're out of your cast, and you can go back to your normal activities, but you probably want to be a little bit more careful. So whatever you were doing when you suffered the break, you probably don't want to do anymore, or you want to be more careful to make sure that whatever accident happened to cause the break doesn't happen again, and to make sure that you are protecting something that has been slightly damaged already. So reform for the United States meant that we were going to try to correct some of the really big problems that we had had before. So one example is the FDIC, which stands for the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. You have probably seen this before if you've ever been into a bank or on a bank's website. You will see that those banks have this little FDIC logo somewhere. If they don't, you don't want to put your money there. And this just means that if something were to happen to the bank, your money is insured. There is a certain limit on it. I can't remember right now exactly what it is, but for those of you who are going to be big shots in your future and have a whole bunch of money, you probably want to spread it out to different financial institutions. But for, those of us who don't have big bank accounts, like your teachers included, we don't really have to worry about that. Basically, up to a certain amount, if something happens to the bank, the government guarantees that you will get it back. It may not be instant, but that money is not just going to disappear like had happened to a lot of people with the bank panic at the beginning of the 1930s. We also have the SEC, which is the Securities and Exchange Commission, and this is going to provide government oversight of the stock market to try to avoid speculation and buying on margin and those things that made our stock prices. Oh, kitty friend. Hello. Those things that made our stock market kind of artificially strong, and then caused it to eventually come crashing down. So most of those things that people were doing back in the day are illegal now. You cannot do them. So as you can see, the government was doing a lot, and Franklin Roosevelt was pushing through a lot. And it was good for people, but it also came at a huge cost. This stuff is expensive. And he's practicing a lot of deficit spending, which means spending money that we don't necessarily have, because you got to remember the government gets their money through tax dollars. And obviously, if people are broke, they ain't paying a lot of taxes. So Roosevelt's kind of going to be racking up this debt that people start to become very critical of. So going into his, what he called the Second New Deal, which is kind of an elevated version of the first, we see some things that start to ruffle some feathers and raise some concerns even more. So there's another organization that was created, the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, which provided jobs to even more additional people. So people like artists and actors and playwrights who, needed to eat just like everybody else. The government is paying them to do things like paint murals in cities and write plays and take photographs of people. And a lot of people say, really, that might be too far. We definitely don't need that. That's not a necessity. And yet the government is going into debt paying people to do that. We also had something called the Wagner Labor Relations Act, which was trying to push through the right for people to have unions. and to practice collective bargaining. So definitely devoted to protecting the workers, which is a huge reversal for the federal government. As you guys remember, when we were talking about labor during the Gilded Age, the government really did not intervene to protect workers. When they did intervene in problems with business and business conflicts, typically they chose the big business over the workers. So this is something that is going to ruffle the feathers of some business people in Roosevelt's second New Deal. We also have the creation of Social Security. So as you guys know, if you're already working, that's something that's automatically taken out of your paycheck, whether you're 16 or 56 or anywhere in between. And that is to provide for your future. So after you retire, you get some money from the government to help you live. And for the last several years, there have been a lot of questions of insecurity over Social Security because as our baby boomers, or as we have started to call them now, just the boomers, are getting older, they are cashing in on that Social Security. And there's so many of them that it's overwhelming to the Social Security system. And again, this was something that definitely raised some eyebrows because this is going to be a long-lasting program setting up this system that would be funneling out money to people for the foreseeable future. Finally, there was the Fair Labor Standards Act, and this is what established the typical 40-hour work week, the idea of overtime being paid to people who go outside of that, the minimum wage, and it also got rid of child labor. So definitely some good things there, but there were a lot of critics who felt that the government was doing too much and maybe kind of overstepping their rights a little bit, being a little too intrusive in business and the lives of people. And so we start to get some rejection of FDR's New Deal, the second New Deal. And part of that comes from the Supreme Court. And they start to reject a lot of his policies, saying that, it's not constitutional for the government to be taking so much liberty with their power. So FDR has a response to that, and this is going to be probably the biggest mistake or stain on his presidency. And that is something called the court packing scheme. Basically, Roosevelt wanted to add a bunch of justices to the Supreme Court, up to 15, because as you guys know, one of the powers of the president is to be able to appoint those justices. So he felt if he increased the number and he was able to make a bunch of appointments and choose the people who would support his policies, he wouldn't have to worry about them being rejected anymore. But this, of course, kind of made him look a little, abusive of his power. And people started to question if he had kind of, gone off his rocker here and gotten a little too used to being in charge, a little too big for his britches. So, a lot of people look back on the New Deal and they question whether or not it was successful. Did it provide some relief for people? Certainly. Was it enough? Maybe not. Were there reforms and new things created that even last to today that are very helpful? Of course. But did Roosevelt take too many liberties with his power? Possibly. So you guys are going to have an assignment in which you're asked to evaluate how effective and successful you think the New Deal was using some primary sources. So I'm going to ask you to complete that. And in the next episode of this, we'll be talking the next episode because I'm a TV star now. But in the next video, we'll be talking about World War II, which of course is what actually gets us out of the Great Depression. War's big business, and it'll bring a lot of action to us that will get us out of the Depression. So do some more research if you want on the New Deal. There's lots of videos and lots of articles out there that you can look at. And go ahead and take care of that assignment. Let me know if you have any questions. Stay well. Bye.